We have been studying Old Testament history, and we are been for quite a while now, actually, over the last several weeks, we've been talking about Moses and the various aspects of the things that he encounters with the Israelites. We're about finished in the terms of the life of Moses because he's giving his last instructions, last bit of guidance and help to the Israelites. He will eventually die. God will bury him, and the conquest of the Promised Land will start not long after that as it relates to the leadership of Joshua. If you're following in your worksheets, this is lesson 15. This is the lesson that Bill started with you in my absence on Sunday, and he told me that you got partway down the page anyway, and I guess down to the point where it says bless the blessings of obedience. We'll talk a little bit about that. And I'm going to spend a lot of time tonight, in fact, most of the time, probably in Deuteronomy chapter 28. So if you want to open your Bibles to Deuteronomy chapter 28, most of our time is going to be spent there in that text tonight, although we may look at some other narratives before we're done. Just bear with me for a second, because I didn't realize I had forgotten to pull up the notes and such. So basically, Moses is going to tell them, if you obey, what happens? You'll be blessed. If you disobey, what happens? You curse, right? And it's pretty simple in a lot of ways. Um, it's interesting, and you talked a little bit, and Bill said you got down and kind of, and I'll reiterate it a little bit in case you didn't talk too much about it, but he did mention that you talked some about the fact that there were some promises of God that are conditional and some are unconditional, right? I mean, so some of the promises of God depend on what I do, how I act, how I behave, the choices that I make. Other promises that God makes are irrelevant in some senses to what I do or how I act or how I behave. When it comes to Abraham and Moses, which one is which? If you were to kind of classify one as the conditional and one as the unconditional, then how would you classify it? Okay, Abraham appears to be unconditional, right? Abraham and the promises made to him seem to just be very matter of fact. This is what's going to happen. I'm making you a promise. Through your seed, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Through your seed, you're going to see a multitude like the stars of the sky. Very specific promises that don't seem to have a whole lot of condition, if any, placed upon it. By the time those promises are beginning to be fulfilled in Moses, now the language changes a little bit. And as he speaks to Moses, he says, yes, I'm going to honor the original promises that I made to Abraham, but as it relates to the people themselves, they're going to receive benefit and or consequence based on their choices and decisions. And let me ask you simply tonight, is that fair? Yeah, right? It is fair, especially considering all that God had already done for them and their lack of appreciation along the way, if you will, as it relates to that. And so I think it's absolutely fair that God placed, in some senses, these stipulations, if you will, concerning His conditional promises, though He will no doubt complete the unconditional promise that made to Abraham. The difference is God didn't say specifically who in the lineage of Abraham might fulfill certain promises. He said they'd be fulfilled, but He didn't necessarily label everybody's name and said they automatically get to be a part of this. And so God, which He already even said He might do, right, with Moses, if you recall when He was pretty upset with him there, he said, let me just wipe them out and I'll just start over again with you. And Moses had to beseech God on behalf of the people to even have them spared. And so you see that God made promises to Abraham that they're going to be done. But yet, who gets to fulfill those things and who gets to be part of that lineage um, within the Israelite nation really is about the conditions that they meet or don't meet as it relates to their behavior towards God. I mentioned chapter 28 of Deuteronomy. Let me actually start with you in Deuteronomy chapter 7. I apologize. Deuteronomy chapter 7 and in verse 12. Deuteronomy 7 and in verse 12. So he said, "Wherefore it shall come to pass, if you hearken to these judgments, and keep and do them, that the Lord thy God shall keep unto thee the covenant and the mercy which he sware unto thy fathers. And he will love thee and bless thee and multiply thee. He will also bless the fruit of thy womb, the fruit of thy land, the corn, the wine, the oil, the increase of thy kind, the flocks of the sheep, in the land which he sware unto thy fathers to give thee. Thou shalt be blessed above all people. There shall not be male or female barren among you or among your cattle. And the Lord will take away from thee all sickness, and will put none of the evil diseases of Egypt, which thou knowest, upon thee, but will lay them upon all them that hate thee. Thou shalt consume all the people which the Lord thy God shall deliver thee. Thine eye shall have no pity upon them, neither shalt thou serve their gods, for that will be a snare unto thee." And so this is the principle that we just got done talking about. If, there's the condition, if you hearken to these judgments in verse 12, and you keep them, and you do them, then I'll keep unto thee the covenant and the mercy which I swear unto thy fathers. You will get to be a part of the blessings that I want to extend if you keep the commands and teachings. This isn't about God saying, well, I'm going to negate or overrule my own promise that I made to Abraham. This is God saying, you can be part of it or not be part of it. It's your choice. I'll move on to the next what? What's he already done? Next generation, right? I'll just move to the next generation. I don't have to use you to honor the original promises. That's kind of the sentiment that Moses wants them to understand before they ever go into the promised land. That God didn't guarantee any particular generation that they were going to be the ones who receive certain kinds of benefits. You meet the condition of obeying God, I'll bless you. Great things are going to happen for you. You'll overcome your enemies. You'll have prosperity. Things are going to be really well. Refuse that, and I can just choose the next generation to propel and to continue the promises that I make. That's a principle that Moses wants the people to grasp and understand, and he mentions it here in Deuteronomy chapter 7, and it'll come up again in his final kind of dissertation and conversation with them in chapter 28. The questions were asked then. Let me get to questions 6 and 7 just because before I dig into chapter 28 of Deuteronomy. But he said, list some of the ways in which the people would be blessed in the land of Canaan. So what are some of those blessings? And we're going to see them in chapter 28, but I just thought I'd give you a chance to answer that head. Okay, homes, houses, places to live, good health. What else might come? Yeah, wells you didn't dig. Hey, imagine the benefit of that in terms of prosperity and from a health and wellness standpoint. Yeah. And so what would these blessings cause all the nations to see? And see the power of the God that's leading these people. And hopefully generate a respect for Jehovah even among the heathen nations that were in and around the Israelites. So let's look at that. Deuteronomy chapter 28, if you're not there yet. And again, like I said, I'm going to spend the bulk, if not all of our time tonight in this chapter, because there's a lot we need to talk about as it relates to what Moses is trying to get them to appreciate in relationship to these things. So he says, and it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth. I'm going to exalt you if you'll obey and follow the commands. All these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. What's interesting is he didn't say if you pick up a hammer and build it. He said if you obey me, I'll provide it. You obey the commands. Now be careful. When you say that, there are folks who like to translate that health and wealth gospel in a sense and kind of try to translate that similar kind of message as if Jesus said the same kinds of things. Now, it's different. Their nation was physical. God intended for Israel to be a physical nation. And so when he spoke of the blessings and the benefits that he would bring to them, they had lots of physical connotations to them because they were a physical nation of people. It doesn't necessarily translate in the same kinds of promises that are made in Jesus. In some ways, different kinds of promises. Not that God refuses to take care of Christians like he did Israel, but the relationship is different and the circumstances are different. But for them, it's basically, hearken to my voice and the blessings are going to come. Follow the commands and I'm going to send them. You'll be blessed shall be thou be if you're in the city, if you're out where? Out in the field. Blessed shall be the fruit of thy body, the fruit of thy ground, the fruit of thy cattle, increase of thy kind. That's exactly what he was telling them in Deuteronomy 7, by the way, as well, right? Flocks of the sheep. Blessed shall be thy basket in thy store. Blessed shalt thou be when thou comest in. Blessed shalt thou be when thou goest out. The Lord shall cause thine enemies that rise up against thee to be smitten before thy face. They shall come out against thee one way and flee before thee 7 ways. You think about that. And of course, that kind of complete number, that 7. But you think about a military power coming to attack Israel, and they come in force, right? You've got this one large body of an army that's coming forth straight on. We're more powerful and larger than this small little nation of Israel, and we're just going to take them head on, and they'll come at you that way. But when you bring the battle to them, they scatter in all kinds of directions away because of the Lord. The Lord shall command the blessing upon thee in thy storehouses, and all that thou settest thine hand unto, and he shall bless thee in the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. The Lord shall establish thee as a holy people unto himself, as he hath sworn unto thee, if thou shalt keep the commandments of the Lord thy God and walk in his ways. Repeatedly, the same conditional arguments made. Obey the commands, and this is going to be the result. Now, let me ask you a quick question. Does that language in those handful of verses sound similar to anything? Just the basic language that's used. Why does that sound similar? Who else used similar kind of language? Well, let me show you. Run to Matthew chapter 5. But notice the contrast. So in the days of Moses, it was your land will be blessed, your cattle will be blessed, your flocks will be blessed, your house will be blessed, your womb will be blessed. It's about that physical nation that God wanted to bring blessing and benefit to because he had made earthly kinds of promises to them. By the time the promise is fulfilled now, right, in Jesus, and Jesus starts talking about blessings, where does he say those blessings are found? Within the kingdom. This is a description of his citizenry. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who empty themselves. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. And blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. All of those blessings that Jesus talked about are what kind of blessings? Spiritual. They all have a spiritual connection. And so in the days of Moses, they needed physical blessings because they needed to sustain a nation of people in order to live and sustain themselves long enough for Jesus to arrive on the scene in the time that God intended. By the time Jesus actually arrives and then begins to preach and teach, He's already changing that message of what kinds of blessings that God intends for people to experience and have, and who are the blessed ones. Israel was the blessed ones in that day. And you had to be part of that nation in order to be blessed by the hands of God. As it relates to Jesus, anyone who's willing to come and adopt these characteristics of a citizen can now be part of the blessings and benefit of God. It's transitional. And I just thought it was interesting to compare those two. How that series of blessings that would come to them as a nation had physical written all over it because that's what they were. Jesus talks about blessings and who's blessed, and it's all about spiritual dispositions and characters and how it is that we live and conduct ourselves. And it's kind of an interesting contrast to look at. But let's go back to Deuteronomy chapter 28. So, he gives them a series of blessings, right? All these great things can happen to you if you'll just hearken to His commands, listen to His voice, obey the instructions that God shall give. And as verse 14 says, thou shalt not go aside from any of the words which I command thee this day, to the right hand or to the left, to go after other gods to serve them. Honor it all, right? Don't look to your left hand or your right hand. Don't look around, see if there's something you could adopt from somebody else. You need to honor all of it. Do all of the law of God. That's what He's asking of you, in order that you might gain the benefit. But here's the problem. What's He begin to say in verse 15? Yeah, there's another side of this conversation Moses says we need to have. And the other side of that conversation is what happens if we don't? Right? You know, isn't that kind of, I want to say typical, that's not fair, but that is kind of common where somebody's given a big long list of instructions, and at the end of that, whether they verbalize it or not, in the back of their mind they're thinking, well, what if I don't? What if I don't? What are you going to do about it, right? What are you going to do? If I don't, you can give me instructions all day long. If I don't like them, or I don't want to honor them, then you know, what are you going to do about it? Well, Moses answers that question for anybody who might have a mind to think that way. Before they can ever really raise the, well, what if we don't? Moses just tells them, here's what happens if you don't. If you choose something else, if you choose to not obey, if you choose to ignore certain of His commands and instructions, then here is the what if you don't list. And what's interesting is it's much more lengthy than the initial list of the blessings that come. He spends about 14 verses, in this moment anyway, spends about 14 verses, if you will, talking to them about the blessings that come when you follow the commands. Spends the next to verse 68 talking about the challenges and circumstances and difficulties they're going to bring to themselves if they choose a different path. And so let's note some of that. If it comes to pass that you won't hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe to do all His commandments, His statutes, which I command thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. And then he lists what? All the same things he listed that could be blessings. Follow the commands, all these things could be blessings. Ignore the commands, all the very same things that could be blessings to you now become a curse. Whether you're in the city or in the field, or you're talking about what you've got laying in store, fruit of your body, fruit of the land, your flocks, your cattle. All those same very things that God says I can bless you in if you follow me and obey my commands are the very same things that I can curse you in and bring challenge and destruction because of those decisions. He can make a pestilence cleave. You think about that. You know, he made a reference. Remember when we read earlier? he said that you won't have the sickness that you saw where? In Egypt. My general conclusion about that, he's probably referencing what? All the plagues, right? Because there was sickness and disease involved in those plagues, and the things went along with it. And at certain moments in time in that series of plagues, who got spared? They did. Not all of it, but there hit a point, right, where they begin to become spared from the cursings that were coming to Egypt. And in a sense, God's trying to use that as a picture. You can go back to be disobedient, and you can go back to all the same pestilence and sickness and challenges and disease that you experienced and saw and witnessed back there in Egypt, or you can obey and avoid it. But I can come and smite thee with a consumption, with a fever, an inflammation, an extreme burning, with the sword, and with blasting, mildew. They shall pursue thee until thou perish. Thy heaven that is over thy head shall be brass, the earth that is under thee shall be iron. The Lord shall make the rain of thy land powder and dust from heaven shall it come down upon thee until thou beest destroyed. It's really sad to think that Moses leaves no lack of clarity. This is exactly what's going to happen if you disobey. And we have the ability to do what, by the way, as it relates to that history? Yeah, we could actually watch that exactly happen. The way Moses warned and gave them every kind of reason to obey, every piece of information they needed to know what the consequences would be if they don't. And they did anyway. They still rejected his commands. They still rejected his instructions. They still walked away from him. And because of that, now they're facing the consequences. And now they're facing the challenges because of those decisions when they moved forward in their history. He's warning them. We're reading the warnings, but we can also fast forward in the history, which we're going to do before we're done tonight, and see how these very things that God told them were going to happen happened exactly as he said they would. Good, Mom. Yeah, I think he's addressing, in this context, he's not addressing what's going to happen to a particular individual, but this is a nation as a whole. If you're making these decisions, there's always a remnant, right? The Bible always speaks about a remnant who's striving to honor even in the midst of those who won't. I mean, even in the midst of the sadness that's going on when the Babylonian captivity issues are going on, still have men like Jeremiah, still have men like Ezekiel. Um, but the consequences hit the whole nation because of the general behavior of the whole nation. Yeah, right. That you're not going to see necessarily a disconnect between individual behavior and the collective behavior. The collective behavior is bad because the individuals are choosing it, and so from an overall standpoint. So all kinds of calamities, and we could read through those, but um, and it's it's interesting, and I'm going to be careful, but we're grown-ups here. But you think about verse 30 for a second here, right? And thou shalt betroth a wife, and another man shall lie with her. Thou shalt build a house, and thou shalt dwell therein. Thou shalt plant a vineyard, and shalt not gather the grapes thereof. Uh, you're you're going to be, though it's the nation that's causing it in a sense, but you're going to personally feel the the punishment, if you will. You're gonna see some pretty sad behaviors Because once the nation starts going down a path that's away from God, then the individuals just go further into the sinful behaviors. It's a progression that go hand in hand. As the nation degenerates, then the people's personal behaviors will as well. And it's sad. And he says, "Thine ox shall be slain right before your eyes. You'll not eat any of it. Your donkey shall be violently taken away from before thy face, shall not be restored to thee. Thy sheep shall be given unto thine enemies, and thou shalt have none to rescue them. Thy sons and thy daughters shall be given unto another people, and thine eyes shall look and fail with longing for them all the day long. There shall be no might in thine hands." Pretty sad when the whole point was to get out of Egyptian bondage. And they've now been out of that Egyptian bondage a little over 40 years or so. And Moses is already telling them, even though they're only 40 rough odd years removed from a 400, well, not a 400 year, but that's how long they were in Egypt total. But from a bondage that was back there in Egypt, but he already knows through the wisdom of God that they're going to walk right back into the very paths that are going to bring them back into bondage again. You're going to watch your children be taken off and become slaves to somebody else. It's sad what happens when people walk away from God. Go ahead, Jim. Yeah, yeah. Because of in that nation, yeah, absolutely. It's just the reverse, basically. Is what he talks about. Notice verse 37. Thou shalt become an astonishment, a proverb, and a byword among all nations, whither the Lord shall lead thee. He says other nations are going to see what you gave up. We've witnessed similar kinds of things, right? Somebody had everything in the world going for them, but for whatever reason that none of us can even remotely figure out, they throw it all away for a moment of sin, a momentary choice, whatever it is. They're willing to just toss it all aside. And then they become a byword. People talk about it, right? Remember so-and-so? How wonderful they had it. And for this, they chose this instead. And that's kind of the way Israel's going to become to the other nations. People are going to say, well, look at all the things that their God was doing for them, and they chose something different. Why would they do that? You'll carry seed out into the field and shall gather but little in, for the locust shall consume it. It's one issue after the other. The stranger that is within thee shall get up above thee very high, and thou shalt come down very low. It's interesting because that's kind of what would happen in Egypt because of Pharaoh to get concerned. Was they were growing and multiplying and getting stronger, and it became fearful that the stranger that was living within Egypt was going to become more powerful than the Egyptians. And now God says that's what's going to happen to you. Your strangers are going to come into your land, and they're going to gain power and strength, and they're going to be higher or exalted above even you. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. He already before you've ever even seen the judges yet, he's already referring to a leader that they're acknowledging as a king um, that that will be dethroned basically by nations elsewhere. And we'll talk more about that before we're done tonight. Go ahead, Jim. And we don't have any better answer than they would have. Any other thoughts? Let me um, let me share a couple of texts with you. Uh, and be honest, I think within Deuteronomy chapter 28, you can actually see, I think, both Babylonian issues that are going to eventually come to the people. I think you can also see Roman issues that are going to come and challenge the people. I think that the testimony of Moses here isn't just pointing towards one particular moment in time where these kinds of calamities will come. I think he's pointing to multiple moments. And you can go into history and see what happens to the nation, both first by the Babylonian captivity that's going to come, where they'll see their children get it, and then the ultimate destruction that comes at the hands of Rome later on. But notice with me for a moment a couple of texts. Go to Jeremiah chapter 36. Think about all these things that he mentioned there. But in Jeremiah chapter 36, note with me verse 32. He said, Then took Jeremiah another roll and gave it to Baruch the scribe, the son of Neriah, who wrote therein from the mouth of Jeremiah all the words of the book which Jehoiakim, king of Judah, had burned in the fire. And there were added besides unto them many like words. If you recall, God sends a message to Jeremiah and says, Jehoiakim know the kind of destruction that's on the horizon. What did Jehoiakim do with it? Well, this text tells us, but there's another text that gives us a little more information about that scene. He took a what, if you recall? Takes a penknife, right? Takes a knife and cuts it. Then he throws it in the fire. Basically, I'm not even paying attention to this. Cuts it up, throws it in the fire, and it's consumed, burned. And so God tells Jeremiah, get another roll. And I'm going to give you even more. And it reminds me a little bit of what Moses is doing here. One after another, Moses keeps telling them, here's another curse that can come. Here's another curse that can come. Here's another curse that can come. And they're living it. In the days of Jeremiah, one right after the other. Notice 2 Chronicles chapter 12. Just trying to show you examples of how the very things that Moses is trying to tell them are going to happen end up fulfilled in the people. But notice verse 8 of 2 Chronicles chapter 12. Nevertheless, they shall be his servants. You're going to serve other kings. You serve other people. They may know my service. Go to Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel chapter 20, verse 24. This is the condition of the people during the Babylonian captivity, because they had not executed my judgments, and they had despised my statutes. The very things Moses told them not to do had polluted my Sabbaths, and their eyes were after their fathers' idols. Wherefore I gave them also statutes that were not good, and judgments whereby they should not live. They were choosing to do the very things and bring consequence to themselves, the very things that Moses had warned them about are being fulfilled, not just during the Babylonian time, but you can press forward into Roman time as well and see those things happening. So the point I'm simply trying to illustrate by these texts is this. What we're seeing here in these instructions and things that Moses is saying, we know they're true because we see them actually happen to the people. We know exactly what Moses was saying here in Deuteronomy 28 is absolutely true because it's the very things that you see occur to the people when they choose to ignore God. Questions up to that point? All right, jump to verse 49. Deuteronomy chapter 28. So he says, The Lord shall bring a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth. A nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. A nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor show favor to the young. And he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, or oil, or the increase of thy kind, or flocks, or sheep, until he have destroyed thee. He shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest thou throughout all thy land. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which the Lord thy God hath given thee. Again, and you keep reading and you see the same kinds of conversations that he's already showed. But you can see, again, both Babylonian and Romans involved in both of these things. It's interesting. Does anybody, and if you think about what the narrative said, does anybody know what the ensign or the insignia of Rome had on it? Had an eagle on it. It's interesting that he noticed it back here when he said that nation was coming. He said like an eagle, and when Moses talked about that, and that's the very sign that the Romans had when he said it would come. There in verse 49, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand. It's just interesting, to me anyway. And again, he doesn't specify him here. I get that. He doesn't specify what nation that he's referring to. He's just talking in general about what will happen to them if they refuse to obey the statutes and commands and instructions of God. But it is interesting when he talks about there's going to become a nation from, and where were the Babylonians in reference to them? Okay, but which one is closer? That's a better question. Was the Babylonian captivity or the Babylonian rule over them, was that an easier issue for Babylon to do than, and I'm giving it away here, than Rome, right? Okay. Notice he said, a nation against thee from far, from the end of the earth. You're going to be you're going to be besieged by a nation not just to your north, Babylon. You're going to be troubled by a nation from far away that's going to come and like a swift eagle and has fierce countenance and challenge to bring to you. Jump to Matthew 24 for a moment. I've got the right text here. And I believe in this narrative you're talking about probably the destruction of Jerusalem and things as it relates to that which happened under which nation's rule? Rome, who we're talking about. And wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered. And Moses talked about them coming as swift as an eagle, and you've got the insignia or the sign of Rome is the eagle. And now when he talks about that ultimate destruction that coming, he talks about there will the eagles be gathered together. Again, I'm just illustrating to you. I guess I would be hard-pressed to absolutely prove with 100% certainty that that's the reason why that reference is made in Moses' writings and his teachings. But it sure seems interesting anyway that he uses the reference of this eagle, and then that becomes the sign of the nation that comes in Rome, and then that's the reference Jesus makes when he talks about those things that are on the horizon. But the destruction that Rome brought to them and the difficulties of it are extremely severe, and we can witness that from various aspects. So a foreign nation is going to come. Your country is going to be laid to waste. And the difficulties that come because of that. But you can see also that happen even in the days of the kings and ultimately in that Babylonian captivity. Go to 2 Kings chapter 6 with me. 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 28. Under a besiegement in this circumstance, this is how bad it got. The king said unto her, What aileth thee? And she answered, This woman said unto me, Give thy son, that we may eat him today, and we will eat my son tomorrow. So we boiled my son, and did eat him, and I said unto her on the next day, Give thy son, that we may eat him, and she's hid it. That's the depravity of the people. When these nations come in and besiege, these are God's people. And you think about it, how sad it got during some of these situations in their existence, and what's the only thing they had to do to avoid all that? Obey God. That's it. That's it. You know, that's and it gets a little bit back to what Jim was talking about earlier. It becomes difficult sometimes to grasp why people are willing to sacrifice the blessings that God wants to bestow upon them. They would have had them in perpetuity as a nation of people. God would have just kept blessing and blessing so every step along the path as they would have obeyed His commands. That wouldn't have stopped, by the way, if they'd embraced Jesus. I realize that wasn't the plan that God intended. I know that wasn't what He knew was going to happen. I get it. I understand He has foreknowledge of what's actually going to occur. But my point is simply this. God didn't put any caveat to that. He just said, if you'll obey the commands, if you'll follow the instructions, I'll just keep blessing you. But they chose to turn away, and this is the kind of thing that happened because of it. This kind of brutality and sadness among the people because of the difficulties they brought upon themselves. Go to Lamentations, chapter 4, verse 10. The hands of the pitiful women have sodden their own children. They were their meat in the destruction of the daughter of my people. No wonder this is called Lamentations. No wonder he's lamenting that people had become, in their own mind, so desperate that this was the choices they were making. But all because they abandoned the commands, statutes, judgments, instructions of God. You'd never gotten this desperate if we hadn't walked away from God to begin with. Now, let's learn something from that. Yes, our relationship with God is different. Our situation is different. Our relationship and connection to Him through Jesus is spiritual and not the same kind of physical connection they had. But the same thing will happen. If we obey the commands of God, He sustains us, cares for us, watches over us, ultimately saves us in eternal salvation at the end of the day. If we'll dishonor that. Go ahead, Christy. I'm sorry. Yeah. 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 And I think that's an excellent point to remind us of. But I think it's also it's what I'm looking for. But it's what happens to anybody. You lose the joy of serving God, and the next minute you'll just quit serving Him, right? You lose the passion to honor Him, serve Him, follow His commands. You lose the heart that goes behind that service and the obedience to those commands. Then it's hard to do them. It's hard to fulfill the commands and because they're not always what I want to do. They don't always fit what I'm looking for in life. They don't always measure up to what I was thinking I'd like to do with my life or the choices I'd like to make. And if I lose that heart, then it can create a thought process in my own thinking that'll definitely lead me away from Jehovah. And so, not just fulfill the commands, but do it with the heart and passion and joy that God would desire from them. But again, the destructive things that happen when they abandon God are written throughout their history. Um, no matter really at what point you look at as it relates to their departing from God's will. Any other points, thoughts, questions up? We just read in Lamentations, we just read in 2 Kings 6. Notice what he said in verse 57. He told them that's what they'd do when the sieges come. And it's one of those things where you wonder, why didn't the light bulb ever go off, right? Why didn't alarm bells, as soon as you started getting to the proximity of these kinds of destructive, deprived things, why didn't the light bulbs go off and bells ring in your head? And you go, oh, whoa, this is exactly what Moses had warned us about. Problem is, go ahead, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's right. When you abandon the word, they'd abandon it. And so number one, they probably weren't remembering these things, so they weren't taught them. And also, when you hit this level, in some sense, it's too late. You're already in the siege. You've already created the mess. And though they might be able to seek forgiveness, in some senses, there was no turning back from the consequences that it brought. And that message just continues throughout this narrative. We're running out of time tonight. But notice verse 65. Among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest, but the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing of eyes, and sorrow of mind. Thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, thou shalt fear day and night, shall have none assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even. And at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning. For the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. And the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships. And by the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. And there shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. Moses saying, listen, the difficulties that you're going to bring to yourself if you abandon God, you're going to calamities of every type and kind that you could ever imagine are going to beset you. And yet that's exactly what they chose. Yeah.